The War of 1812 had roots in ongoing tensions between the young United States and Great Britain in the early 19th century. Britain, locked in the Napoleonic Wars with France, imposed strict naval blockades that interfered with American trade. The Royal Navy also impressed thousands of American sailors, forcibly seizing men from U.S. ships and forcing them into British service, claiming they were British subjects. These actions violated American neutrality and sovereignty and sparked outrage in the United States. Additionally, British support for indigenous resistance on the American frontier contributed to friction. The Shawnee leader Tecumseh had formed a confederacy to resist U.S. expansion, and Britain's alliance with native forces, providing arms and support from Canada, angered Americans who suspected British interference in their Northwest territories. Domestically, a faction of U.S. politicians known as the War Hawks, led by Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and others, loudly demanded war to defend American honor and assert national rights. They saw British actions as an affront to U.S. independence and an obstacle to westward expansion. Meanwhile, New England Federalists strongly opposed war, fearing disruption of commerce. Despite this divide, President James Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war, which was approved along partisan lines, Republicans in favor, Federalists against, and signed on June 18, 1812. It was the first formal war declaration in U.S. history. The American war aims were nebulous, officially to stop British maritime abuses and vindicate U.S. sovereignty, but many war hawks also had ambitions of conquering British Canada, which was thinly defended with Britain's attention in Europe. Thus, by mid-1812, the United States and Great Britain were at war. Ironically, unknown to Americans, Britain had moved to repeal the trade restrictions orders in council just days before war was declared, but slow communication meant the conflict went ahead. Britain, for its part, had not sought war with the U.S. while fighting Napoleon, but once hostilities began, it resolved to defend Canada and blockade America. The stage was set for a conflict on multiple fronts, at sea, along the U.S.-Canadian border, and on the frontier. The war would last 2.5 years, from June 1812 to early 1815. 1812, war breaks out. War commenced with American forces attempting invasions of Canada, while Britain took a defensive stance in North America. In July 1812, General William Hull led a U.S. Army across the Detroit River into Upper Canada. Hull issued proclamations urging Canadians to surrender, but his advance was timid, and he soon retreated to the U.S. side upon learning of hostile native ambushes and fearing his supply lines cut. British Colonel, later Major General, Isaac Brock, the military commander in Upper Canada, capitalized on American hesitancy. Brock, together with the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, boldly besieged Fort Detroit. Believing exaggerated reports of British indigenous strength and worrying his inexperienced militia would be massacred if the fort was stormed, Hull lost his nerve. On August 16, 1812, General Hull surrendered Detroit to Brock without a fight. This was a shocking early defeat for the United States, ceding the Michigan Territory to British control and emboldening Britain's Native American allies. Elsewhere, American attempts to invade Canada also faltered. An American force moved toward Montreal from New York, but militia troops under General Henry Dearborn refused to cross the Canadian border, effectively aborting that offensive. On the Niagara front, U.S. militia and regulars under General Stephen Van Rensselaer crossed the Niagara River into Upper Canada, sparking the Battle of Queenston Heights on October 13, 1812. The British, led by Isaac Brock, successfully repelled the invasion. General Brock was killed in the fighting, but the American attack collapsed as militia reinforcements refused to cross to Canada, and U.S. forces were taken prisoner. The failure at Queenston Heights ended U.S. hopes for a quick victory in Canada in 1812. By year's end, the United States had lost Detroit and failed to secure any foothold in Canada. On the high seas, however, the United States enjoyed some surprising successes in 1812. The U.S. Navy was tiny compared to Britain's mighty fleet, yet its few warships were well built and well armed. In August 1812, the American frigate USS Constitution, nicknamed Old Ironsides, encountered the British frigate HMS Guerriere in the Atlantic. The American frigate USS Constitution defeats the British HMS Guerriere in a single-ship engagement on August 19, 1812, as depicted above. This battle was an important early victory for American morale, disproving British naval invincibility. Captain Isaac Hull of the Constitution skillfully outmaneuvered the Guerriere, and within an hour of furious gunnery, the British ship was dismasted and surrendered. It was a stunning upset, one of several duels in which U.S. Navy frigates defeated Royal Navy ships in 1812. In December, the Constitution under Captain William Bainbridge sank another British frigate, HMS Java. These naval victories had limited strategic effect but boosted American confidence. Britain's response was to tighten its blockade of the U.S. coast. By late 1812 and early 1813, the Royal Navy began patrolling American waters more aggressively, bottling up American ships in port and strangling maritime trade. This blockade would gradually expand and seriously hurt the U.S. economy, but in the first months of war, the young U.S. Navy gave Americans reason to cheer. 1813, stalemate and turning points. In 1813, fighting intensified on multiple fronts. The year began poorly for the Americans in the Old Northwest, the Great Lakes region. After the fall of Detroit, General William Henry Harrison took command of the U.S. Northwest Army and attempted to retake the lost territory. In January 1813, Harrison's detachment under General James Winchester engaged British and native forces at the Battle of Frenchtown, also known as the Battle of the River Raisin, in Michigan. The Americans were defeated on January 22, 1813, by British Colonel Henry Proctor and his native allies. Following the American surrender, native warriors, furious at the British decision to leave prisoners behind, massacred around 60 wounded American captives. "Remember the River Raisin" became a rallying cry in the United States for the rest of the war, reflecting outrage over the brutal fate of American soldiers and fueling resolve to drive back the British Native Alliance in the Northwest. By spring 1813, the frontier fight seesawed. In May, British Major General Henry Proctor, with Tecumseh at his side, besieged Fort Meigs in Ohio, where General Harrison was fortified. The fort held out through sporadic fighting, and as provisions ran low, the native allies began dispersing. Proctor lifted the siege. On their retreat back to Canada, Proctor's forces attempted to storm Fort Stephenson on the Sandusky River, but were repulsed with heavy losses in August 1813, marking an end to British offensives in the Ohio region. These failures blunted Britain's momentum in the West. The tide in the Northwest turned decisively in the late summer of 1813. The United States had been building a small fleet on Lake Erie, recognizing that control of the Great Lakes was crucial after the loss of Detroit. Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry led the U.S. Lake Erie Squadron to challenge the British fleet. On September 10, 1813, Perry's flotilla met the British in the Battle of Lake Erie near Put-in Bay. After a hard-fought engagement, during which Perry's flagship was battered and he famously rowed to a second ship, the Niagara, to continue the fight, the American fleet won a decisive victory, capturing all 6 British vessels. Perry reported to General Harrison in triumph, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours," a phrase that echoed across the country. The U.S. victory on Lake Erie secured American control of the lake and cut British supply lines. Crucially, it forced the British Army under Proctor to abandon Detroit and retreat east in Upper Canada. General Harrison seized this opportunity. He advanced into Upper Canada after the fleeing British. On October 5, 1813, Harrison's army, with mounted Kentucky volunteers, caught up with Proctor's force along the Thames River in Ontario. At the ensuing Battle of the Thames, the Americans routed the British and their native allies. Tecumseh, the influential Shawnee leader, was killed in this battle, and his death marked the collapse of native resistance in the Old Northwest. The Battle of the Thames was a major turning point. It enabled the United States to recapture Detroit and eliminated the British threat in the Northwest frontier. Harrison's campaign, combined with Perry's naval triumph, secured the Ohio-Michigan area for the U.S. for the remainder of the war. Meanwhile, along the U.S.-Canadian border in 1813, other actions took place. In April 1813, American forces raided and captured York, Toronto, the capital of Upper Canada. They burned the provincial parliament and other public buildings there. This act of arson, whether accidental or deliberate, is debated, would be remembered by the British and Canadians, and later retaliated against in 1814. American General Zebulon Pike was killed by an explosion during the York campaign. The Americans withdrew from York but took war material and a symbolic victory. In late May 1813, U.S. forces won the Battle of Fort George at the Niagara River's mouth, briefly securing a foothold in the Niagara region. However, the Americans failed to advance much beyond their bridgehead. In October 1813, a two-pronged U.S. invasion aimed at Montreal ended in failure. Americans were defeated by French-Canadian militia and Mohawk warriors at the Battle of Chateauguay on October 26th, and another column got bogged down and was repulsed at Chrysler's Farm on November 11th. These setbacks, along with heavy logistical difficulties, ended American offensive operations in Lower Canada, Quebec, in 1813. The frontier north of New York returned to stalemate. While the Northern Border War stagnated in 1813, the Atlantic coast saw increasing British raids. The Royal Navy, enjoying command of the sea, launched hit-and-run attacks on American port towns. Notably in the Chesapeake Bay, Admiral George Cockburn led British raids in the spring and summer of 1813. British Marines burned settlements like Havre de Grace, Maryland, May 1813, and menaced Norfolk and other ports. These incursions spread alarm along the coast and foreshadowed larger invasions to come. Far to the south, a parallel conflict was unfolding with significant implications for the war. In August 1813, violence erupted in the Creek Nation, present-day Alabama, in what became known as the Creek War. A faction of the Creek Muskogee people, called the Red Sticks, allied with Tecumseh's movement and opposed American encroachment. On August 30th, 1813, Red Stick warriors attacked Fort Mims in the Mississippi Territory, killing 500 settlers, men, women, and children. This Fort Mims massacre horrified Americans and prompted a forceful response. In the fall of 1813, General Andrew Jackson of the Tennessee Militia was given command to crush the Red Sticks. Jackson led a brutal campaign through Creek territory that would culminate the next year. Though the Creek War was partly an internal civil war among the Creeks, it became entwined with the War of 1812, since the Red Sticks received limited support from British agents and Spanish Florida, and their uprising threatened the U.S. Gulf Coast frontier. By the end of 1813, the war had reached a stalemate of sorts. The United States had rallied after early defeats. Detroit was retaken, and the Northwest Territory largely secured. But American invasions of Canada had failed to break British defenses. Conversely, Britain held Upper Canada and had even made gains, occupying parts of the Michigan Territory earlier in the year, but suffered significant setbacks in the West and lacked the strength to invade the U.S. from Canada in 1813. As 1814 approached, both sides still sought a decisive advantage, and diplomacy had not yet yielded a peace. The stage was set for a climactic year. 1814 Climax of the war. The year 1814 proved decisive, as major offensives were launched by both sides. Early in 1814, the strategic picture changed dramatically in Britain's favor with the defeat of Napoleon in Europe. Napoleon abdicated in April 1814, ending the war on the European continent, at least temporarily. This freed up veteran British troops and naval resources to be deployed to North America. The British now planned major attacks to force a conclusion to the war: an invasion from Canada into New York, raids in the Chesapeake to threaten the U.S. capital, and an expedition against New Orleans to seize control of the Mississippi. Meanwhile, General Andrew Jackson's campaign against the Creek Red Sticks reached its climax. On March 27, 1814, Jackson's militia, along with allied Cherokee and Lower Creek warriors and U.S. regulars, trapped the Red Sticks at Horseshoe Bend on the Tallapoosa River in present-day Alabama. In a fierce battle, Jackson's forces overwhelmed the Creek defenses, killing perhaps 800 Red Stick warriors, a devastating loss. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend effectively crushed the Red Stick resistance. In August 1814, the defeated Creeks were compelled to sign the Treaty of Fort Jackson, dictating huge land cessions over 20 million acres in Alabama and Georgia to the United States. This removed indigenous opposition in the American Southeast and secured Jackson's fame as an Indian fighter. It also eliminated a potential British ally in the Gulf Coast region, just as British forces arrived to mount their own campaign. The Creeks, however, had largely been defeated before British aid could fully materialize. In the Northern Theater, Americans and British clashed in what would be the final major battles along the Canadian border. In mid-1814, the U.S. launched another invasion into Upper Canada across the Niagara frontier. An American army under Generals Jacob Brown and Winfield Scott crossed the Niagara River from Buffalo and captured Fort Erie on July 3, 1814. Advancing north, they met the British at the Battle of Chippewa on July 5, 1814. In this open-field battle, Winfield Scott's well-drilled regulars defeated a British force, demonstrating that American troops could hold their own in European-style combat. The victory at Chippewa boosted American morale. Encouraged, the Americans pushed further into Canada. The British, now reinforced with some veterans from Europe, regrouped under General Gordon Drummond. The two sides collided again on July 25, 1814, at the bloody Battle of Lundy's Lane, near Niagara Falls. Lundy's Lane was one of the fiercest and deadliest battles of the war. Fighting raged well into the night at close range. Each side suffered heavy casualties, nearly 800 British and 850 American killed or wounded. By dawn, the battle was tactically inconclusive, but General Brown's injured American army withdrew back toward Fort Erie, yielding the field. The Americans held Fort Erie against a British siege in August-September 1814, then ultimately abandoned it and retreated to U.S. soil in November. Thus, despite hard-fought battles, the Niagara campaign ended without a decisive victor, though American forces had proven their improved professionalism. While the Niagara front was stalemated, Britain attempted a major invasion from Canada into the United States farther east. In the late summer of 1814, British Lieutenant General Sir George Prevost led a force of about 10,000 British regulars south from Montreal, aiming to cut into New York via the Lake Champlain corridor. This thrust encountered a formidable obstacle at Plattsburgh, New York, where American General Alexander Macomb and Master Commandant Thomas Macdonough prepared a warm reception. On September 11, 1814, a pivotal joint land-naval battle took place. On Lake Champlain, Macdonough's small American flotilla met the British fleet in the Battle of Plattsburgh, Battle of Lake Champlain, and won a stunning victory, capturing or destroying much of the British naval force. At the same time, on land, Prevost's troops skirmished with Macomb's army, but did not launch a full assault on the American fortifications at Plattsburgh. When news arrived that the British naval squadron had been defeated, Prevost's invasion was halted. With their supply line on the lake cut, the British Army retreated back to Canada to avoid being stranded. The American triumph at Plattsburgh was strategically crucial. It forced the British to abandon their northern invasion and strengthened the U.S. position in ongoing peace negotiations in Europe. British officials, frustrated that Prevost retreated so quickly, would later criticize his leadership. As these northern battles played out, the most dramatic British attack fell upon the Chesapeake Bay region. The young nation's capital itself lay in the crosshairs. In August 1814, a British expeditionary force commanded by Major General Robert Ross and Admiral George Cockburn sailed into Chesapeake Bay, intent on striking Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. About 4,500 British regulars landed in Maryland and marched toward Washington. President Madison hastily mustered militia to defend the capital. On August 24, 1814, the two sides met at the Battle of Bladensburg just outside Washington. The encounter was a debacle for the Americans. Poorly led militia units broke and fled under British attack. President Madison, who was present, lamented the rapid militia collapse. The road to Washington was left open. That evening, General Ross's troops entered Washington, D.C., unopposed, and carried out the infamous burning of Washington. The British troops, seeking revenge for the American burning of York in 1813, set fire to public buildings in Washington on the night of August 24 to 25. They burned the White House, the U.S. Capitol, and other government facilities, including the Treasury and War Department. President Madison, his cabinet, and Dolly Madison had fled the city, with the First Lady famously saving Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington from the White House. The British made sure to burn the interior of the Capitol, which housed the Library of Congress, and left the city heavily damaged. However, the occupation was brief. A sudden heavy thunderstorm and tornado, by some accounts, struck Washington on August 25th, extinguishing some fires and causing casualties among the occupiers, and the British withdrew after about 24 hours, returning to their ships. The burning of Washington was a humiliation for the United States, marking the only time a foreign power has captured and occupied the U.S. Capitol. Notably, Ross ordered that private homes be spared, limiting the destruction to public property. News of the Capitol's fall was deeply shocking to Americans, though some took grim consolation that Americans had done the same in Canadian towns. Having struck Washington, the British next moved against Baltimore, Maryland, a large port and privateer base that the British viewed as a nest of American corsairs. Baltimore's defenses were more organized. The approach to the city's harbor was guarded by Fort McHenry, and local militias had prepared earthworks on the landward side. The Battle of Baltimore unfolded on September 12 to 14, 1814. First, on September 12th, General Ross's column of about 5,000 men landed at North Point, southeast of Baltimore. American militia engaged them at the Battle of North Point, a delaying action. In an early exchange of gunfire, General Ross was shot and killed by American skirmishers, forcing the British to pause. Command fell to Colonel Arthur Brooke. The British pushed on and met a line of about 15,000 Maryland militia dug in outside Baltimore. After some probing attacks and an artillery duel on September 13th, Brooke judged the land defenses too strong to crack without naval support. Meanwhile, the British Navy, under Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane, attempted to bombard Fort McHenry to pave the way for a naval penetration of Baltimore's harbor. On the night of September 13 to 14, 1814, the Royal Navy unleashed a rain of bombs and rockets at Fort McHenry in a massive bombardment, but the fort's guns answered and prevented any British ships from passing. Despite 25 hours of shelling, Fort McHenry's defenses held firm, and the British failed to subdue the fort. The large American flag flying over Fort McHenry at dawn on September 14th signaled that the fort had survived. This sight inspired Francis Scott Key, an American lawyer detained on a British ship during the battle, to pen a poem titled Defense of Fort McHenry. The verses of Key's poem, describing the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, and the U.S. flag still waving, later became the lyrics of the Star-Spangled Banner, which was set to music and eventually adopted as the U.S. national anthem. With their commander dead and their navy unable to clear a path, the British abandoned the attempt on Baltimore. They quietly slipped away on September 14 to 15th, sailing their troops out of the Chesapeake. The failure at Baltimore, after the success at Washington, meant the British Chesapeake campaign achieved limited strategic results. It did, however, leave a lasting legacy in American memory: the burning of the Capitol and the anthem. As autumn 1814 arrived, both nations were war-weary and negotiations for peace had begun in earnest. Peace talks between American and British diplomats opened in Ghent, Belgium, in August 1814. Throughout the fall, even as fighting continued, negotiators worked to draft a treaty. By December, news of the British setbacks at Plattsburgh and Baltimore stiffened American resolve, while British officials, now free to deploy overwhelming force in 1815 if desired, nevertheless faced war weariness and economic strain at home. Diplomacy gained momentum. 15 Final battles and peace. Although American and British negotiators reached a preliminary peace agreement in December 1814, slow communications meant that military operations continued into early 1815. The most famous battle of the war was yet to come. The British had long planned an assault on New Orleans, which guarded the Mississippi River. In December 1814, as the Ghent talks were concluding, A powerful British expeditionary force of some 8,000 men under General Sir Edward Pakenham landed in British-held Pensacola, Spanish Florida, and then moved toward Louisiana. General Andrew Jackson, fresh from victory over the Creeks, rushed to defend New Orleans with a mix of U.S. Army regulars, state militia, including Tennessee and Kentucky frontiersmen, local Creole and free black volunteers, and even Jean Lafitte's Barratarian pirates. Jackson fortified a line along the Rodriguez Canal, Chalmette Plain, just south of New Orleans, and prepared for the onslaught. Unaware that peace had been signed in Europe, British forces attacked on the foggy morning of January 8, 1815, the main battle of New Orleans. Pakenham ordered a frontal assault against Jackson's entrenched position. It turned into a disaster for the British. The Redcoats, advancing across open ground, were ravaged by American artillery and rifle fire. American and British representatives signed the Treaty of Ghent on December 24, 1814, officially ending the war. News of the treaty did not reach the armies in time to prevent the bloody Battle of New Orleans 2 weeks later. The treaty restored relations between the two nations to the pre-war status quo. In barely half an hour of fighting, Jackson's defenders inflicted horrific casualties on the attacking force. General Pakenham was killed on the battlefield, along with his second-in-command, Major General Samuel Gibbs, and the British suffered over 2,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing, in the failed assault. By contrast, American casualties were astonishingly light, only around 70 killed or wounded. The Battle of New Orleans was a lopsided victory that made Andrew Jackson a national hero. It had no impact on the war's outcome, since a peace treaty was already signed, but it psychologically boosted American pride and cemented the war's legacy in the U.S. as a successful defense of the homeland. It also assured that the British would fully comply with the peace, since they had failed to seize the bargaining chip of New Orleans. Just weeks after New Orleans, the long-awaited peace became official. On February 16, 1815, the United States Senate unanimously ratified the Treaty of Ghent, which President Madison then proclaimed on February 18, formally ending the War of 1812. Britain had ratified the treaty in late December 1814. The Treaty of Ghent essentially ended the war in a draw, with no territory lost or gained by either side. It called for a return to status quo ante bellum, the pre-war boundaries and conditions. All conquered territories were to be evacuated and returned. The British abandoned claims or proposals, floated during negotiations, to create an Indian buffer state in the Northwest and relinquished any occupation of parts of Maine or the Great Lakes they had held during the war. Notably, the treaty made no mention of impressment or neutral rights, the issues that had caused the war, largely because those grievances had faded. With Napoleon defeated, Britain no longer needed to impress sailors or blockade French trade. The treaty did, however, include provisions for commissions to settle U.S.-Canada boundary disputes later, and both nations agreed to work toward ending the slave trade. On the surface, the war concluded with an ambiguous outcome, but beneath that, it had significant consequences for the United States, Great Britain, and North America. Aftermath and consequences. Although the Treaty of Ghent returned things to pre-war norms on paper, the War of 1812 had far-reaching effects on the future of the United States and its neighbors. In the United States, news of the peace and the victory at New Orleans sparked euphoria and a surge of patriotism. Many Americans came to view the war as a second war of independence, a confirmation that the United States could defend its sovereignty and honor against powerful foes. The young nation's military performance was uneven, but by standing up to Great Britain and fighting to essentially a draw, Americans felt a new sense of national confidence. The war produced new heroes whose reputations would shape U.S. history. Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, and William Henry Harrison, the victor of Tippecanoe, 1811, and the Thames, would both ride their wartime fame to the presidency in coming decades. Naval captains like Oliver Hazard Perry and Isaac Hull were celebrated for their victories. The slogans and symbols of the war, "Don't give up the ship," "Remember the raisin," and "The Star-Spangled Banner," became part of American folklore. Politically, one immediate casualty of the war was the Federalist Party. The Federalists had opposed the war from the start, with New England merchants skirting the British blockade, and some Federalist leaders even discussing separate peace or secession. Their Hartford Convention in December 1814, where New England Federalists debated constitutional amendments to curb federal power, and some extremists hinted at secession, unfortunately coincided with the news of Jackson's triumph at New Orleans and the peace treaty. This made the Federalists appear disloyal or even treasonous in the eyes of many. The party's stance against what was perceived as a victorious war effort proved ruinous. In the post-war celebration, the Federalists were discredited as unpatriotic, and the party rapidly withered away. By a few years later, the Federalist Party had effectively vanished as a national force. One-party rule by Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans ensued, ushering in what is known as the Era of Good Feelings, roughly 1815 to 1825. This era saw a brief lull in partisan strife and a sense of national unity under President James Monroe. Without an opposition party, politics focused on issues like economic development and westward expansion, though sectional tensions, especially over slavery, still brewed under the surface. Economically, the war's legacy was complex. The British blockade during the war had strangled American overseas trade, causing hardship especially in New England. Yet, this forced the U.S. to develop domestic manufacturing to substitute for imported goods. In that sense, the War of 1812 stimulated American industry. After the war, the U.S. government, recognizing the need for better infrastructure, began investing in roads and canals. The war also highlighted the need for a stronger financial system, leading to the chartering of the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. With European markets reopened, American commerce resumed, and the economy entered the post-war era of good feelings on an upswing. However, the dependency on exports and the influx of British goods would contribute to the Panic of 1819 a few years later, an early warning of the global economic forces affecting the young nation. One of the most profound outcomes of the War of 1812 was the fate of Native American tribes. By 1815, the power of Eastern Woodlands indigenous confederacies had been broken. Tecumseh's death and the collapse of his confederacy, along with the defeat of the Red Stick Creeks, meant that Native Americans east of the Mississippi could no longer rely on British protection or a pan-Indian alliance to resist U.S. expansion. The British, in negotiating the Treaty of Ghent, dropped demands for a guaranteed indigenous buffer state in the Old Northwest when it became clear they lacked the leverage to insist on it. Native peoples who had fought alongside the British were largely abandoned in the peace. Without British support, indigenous nations were now at the mercy of the United States, which rapidly accelerated expansion into the Midwest and South. Within a few decades, the U.S. government forced most of the eastern tribes off their lands, as seen in the Indian removal policies of the 1830s. The War of 1812 was thus a disaster for Native Americans. It opened the floodgates for white settlement in the Old Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and in the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, ultimately leading to the loss of indigenous homelands and a profound disruption of their ways of life. And indeed, not 1 inch of territory ceded or lost was the proud American mantra about the peace terms. Neither side could claim a clear victory. The United States did not achieve its aim of conquering Canada or force formal concessions on maritime rights, and Great Britain's maritime practices were ended by circumstance rather than by American arms. Yet for the United States, the war imbued a newfound sense of nationhood. The young republic had weathered a second clash with its former colonial master and come out intact, prompting observers at home and abroad to view the U.S. with greater respect. American society celebrated the war's heroes and looked westward to new frontiers with confidence. For Great Britain, the war underscored that the United States, while an upstart, was a permanent presence in North America that had to be accommodated. Never again would Britain treat the U.S. as a hostile foe. Instead, the two nations gradually developed the special relationship in later years. Thus, the War of 1812 closed as a paradoxical conflict, militarily indecisive but consequential nonetheless. It secured the United States on the world stage and ended the last serious Anglo-American hostility. It also erased British and Native American impediments to U.S. continental expansion, paving the way for America's growth, for better or worse, across the continent. The war's legacy endured in an American national anthem inspired by the defense of Baltimore, in the political realignments of the era of good feelings, and in the tragic decline of indigenous nations. In the end, the Treaty of Ghent returned peace to the United States and British Canada, and a peace and amity between the U.S. and Britain ensued, allowing each nation to turn the page to a new chapter of the 19th century. The guns of 1812 had fallen silent, and a generation of Americans would remember with pride that their nation had stood firm and preserved the independence it had won in the Revolution.